Hi everyone, good afternoon. I am Darryl Mead, the Head of Employee Experience at Emperor, and welcome to our session. Joining me today, we have Sasha Scott from the Inclusive Group and Justin Costley, who is co-head of Bristows' Employment Law Team. So thanks for joining the session. So just before we get started, if you have a question, there's a tool in the top left-hand of the screen, so you can just drop a question there and we can take those throughout the session, and we've got some time at the end to answer your questions. So let's crack on. So what a time to be we're experiencing for workplace and the employees. Furlough and return to work are now headline news, which I can't remember a time in my career when the work that I do, supporting employees and the employee experience actually has been headline news. But there's dozens of considerations for leaders and businesses at the moment, particularly on the lines of government guidelines, health guidance, legal parameters. It's almost a bit of a minefield for companies navigating their way through this current situation. But it's fair to say that every business is reviewing and discussing new ways of working. And I'm sure we've all learned a huge amount in the last few months and, gone about communicating in different ways and connecting in completely different ways, which we talked about before, but we're now actually doing. It's interesting, and most of the clients and companies that I'm working with they're all planning a safe return to work and understanding what that means for their employees, both from the health and safety point of view, as a primary concern, but also the guidelines. But actually, some are taking time to completely rethink the employee experience. What does it mean for the office layout? Was different spaces, more collaboration, different ways of working. So, it is a time when everybody's stepping back and thinking, gosh, how do we need to work? What's really important? But I think it goes without saying that flexible working is totally what has emerged from this. And it seems to be that the blend of working from home and in an office is certainly what employees are certainly requesting and keen on. But what does that really mean in practice? I think we'll explore some of that today. And importantly, I think what's really interesting is that employees are really driving this change. Many companies I've spoken to have actually surveyed and asked their employees, what do they need? What do they want when they come back to work? So the needs from employees are really driving this new focus. And the focus is fairly and squarely on well-being, actually. So, whether that's a physical well-being at work, mental health, financial, social, and community well-being. So people are really stepping back and thinking, actually, what does it mean to be at work? What does it look like? And I think really importantly, leaders are listening. And thanks for joining the session today, because it shows that you're interested and keen to understand how we all navigate through this new kind of phase of work. And it's fair to say also that there's no rule book. We're all just kind of making this up as we go to an extent and working out what's the best way for us as a business and as leaders in a business to really reshape how we work in a way that kind of inspires people, helps them feel safe, and actually kind of continues to serve our customers and our stakeholders. So you could say that kind of this is the biggest challenge that we faced this year about, keeping employees motivated, connected, safe. And today, I think we're going to have a look at a few different perspectives on how we might approach this challenge and, a few practical ideas. So firstly, I'd like to hand over to Justin, who's going to talk about some employment law considerations.
Thanks for that, Darryl. So, yeah, this morning I'm going to really focus quite a lot on the health and safety law and compliance angle, because I really think that that's fundamental to any approach that we have about returning to the office. After that, I'll touch a bit on the potential legal claims that an employer may come up against in this context. And then I think lastly, just talk a little bit about testing of employees and some of the issues our clients have come up against in that context. So health and safety in the workplace really, and those obligations really come from two things. First is the Health and Safety at Work Act. And that says that every employer has a duty to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety and welfare of its employees. And if an employer fails to comply with that, then potentially it faces criminal conviction. That conviction can be used in civil proceedings and there can be large fines. So important that's complied with. And I think it's equally important thinking about that in an office environment where health and safety may not have always been that sort of number one priority, because it was quite straightforward. And I think now in the context of returning to work, the pandemic still hanging over to us, the pandemic itself all being about health and the risks to one's health, makes it just vitally important that employers deal with this health and safety challenge. There is then a whole load of I guess judge-led law, which comes from cases on various different employment matters, but that also feeds into this general obligation that employers have, and that broadly translates to or could be understood as an obligation of an employer to put in place a safe system of work for its employees, and to ensure that system is implemented across the workforce. So what should an employer do to ensure that it has a safe working environment? Well, first of all is following the government guidance. And we've seen quite a lot of government guidance, and it does seem to be changing from time to time. Certainly there are sort of the 5 headline points that the government issued fairly early on. So carry out a COVID risk assessment, make sure that you develop cleaning, hand washing and hygiene procedures, help people to work from home, ensure that those people that are coming back into the workplace can observe 2 meter social distancing, and if they can't, then take protective measures for those employees who have to be closer to one another. And then on top of that, or in addition to that, those 5 main points, there are also some sector-specific guidance. And for office-based workplaces, a lot has been said about the various measures that an employer can put in place. So things like not having people hot desking, ensuring that people work at the same workstations, that those workstations are regularly cleaned, that people work adjacent to one another rather than facing one another, that they can wash their hands regularly, that they can, that there is hand sanitizer available. Air contamination is an important issue, and making sure that sort of air circulation is bringing in air from the outside, and there aren't places which are using just closed recycled air, which it seems presents more of a health and safety risk. These things will all need to be understood in formulating any plan that an employer puts together. Observing that government guidance in itself doesn't guarantee that an employer will have complied with its legal obligations. So it's going to have to take its steps itself to comply, which may go beyond that government guidance. Though that said, I think that if you're observing that government guidance, then evidentially that's going to be, you're going to be a long way in terms of ensuring that you're legally compliant. But certainly for the purpose of complying with the Health and Safety at Work Act, you're going to need to undertake a risk assessment. And having undertaken that risk assessment, it's going to be best to share that with employees, because equally they're going to know some of these risks that you may not have identified. They can bring them to your attention, and then you can work together with your workforce to understand what those risks are, the risks that are perceived by the workforce, so that you can then address them in the plan that you propose to adopt in terms of how you operate your workplace to allow employees to come back to it. So formulate it. Once you've got your risk assessment, you've had the feedback from employees, you can then develop your plan. That plan itself then needs to be worked out in conjunction with your employees through consultation with them. And then once that's been formulated, it's likely that achievement of that plan and all the various steps that you want to take will need to be implemented by policies and procedures. And those policies and procedures will need to be fully understood by management. Employees will need to be trained on what they need to do. So how long it takes them to wash their hands, where they, how regularly they need to use hand sanitizers. The fact that they'll need to observe a one-way flow down a particular corridor, for instance. So there will need to be that training. And then once employees have been trained, then management will need to police those policies, and then to the extent they're not being complied with, enforce them and do that actively. And that should give employees confidence that these are measures that are being taken seriously by management. Also, obviously, these are things that will only are currently being formulated by employers. And so the effectiveness of those policies is going to need to be monitored. And if there are things that you're identifying that employees are regularly falling foul of some things, well, perhaps that's the policy's fault. Perhaps that needs to be addressed, made clearer, further training given. I think also in the context of risk assessments, there are certain groups of employees who you will need to focus on specifically. So there are pregnant employees, and there is a statutory requirement to undertake a risk assessment in relation to pregnant employees in any event. And so I think that's going to need to be done again in relation to the COVID workplace environment. Equally, there are employees who suffer from a disability for the purpose of the Equality Act. They may already have reasonable adjustments in place in relation to their pre-COVID workplace. That's going to need to be considered for the COVID workplace. The government has also identified two categories of people, one who are clinically vulnerable and the other which is vulnerable. It's likely that the clinically vulnerable are going to be fall within the definition of disabled for the purpose of the Equality Act. The same may be applicable to those who are identified as being vulnerable, but specific thought will need to be given to the higher risks or the different risks that may apply to them, so that your risk assessment can properly deal with those specific issues in relation to those different groups. In terms of potential legal claims, most of them are the statutory ones, at least, are within the Employment Rights Act, And an employee is able to bring a claim against suffering any detriment, that's broadly some kind of less favourable treatment, or dismissal, if they reasonably believe themselves to be in serious and imminent danger, and which they couldn't avoid if they returned to their workplace, or if they took steps to either protect themselves from those dangers or fellow employees. These are rights that exist from day one of employment, no need for any qualifying service. And it's easy to see in the COVID-19 workplace how employees might legitimately have these fears if they think that there is a risk of exposure and clearly a risk to their health and safety, if certain measures haven't been adopted by an employer. If they are either dismissed, and it's easy to see how a dismissal may arise in these circumstances. They think that they're in imminent danger. They refuse to return to the workplace, or they persuade others to refuse to return to the workplace as well. Then, if they're dismissed for that fact, that dismissal will be automatically unfair. Again, no need for qualifying service. I think that there's a real challenge for the employer who does everything that we've discussed in trying to formulate this safe working environment, as well as there being an employee with these genuine concerns that are presented from the COVID pandemic. And I think that that's a very difficult path to navigate, but is one best done by trying to navigate it with the employee rather than seeking to sanction the employee in some way, be it by reducing pay or stopping payment, subjecting the employee to some disciplinary action, or ultimately dismissing them. A bit like the detriment for and dismissal for imminent danger, you've got whistleblowing protection, which is available to employees, and this provides a fair amount of protection, equally which one can see being used by employees in this return to work environment, because a protected disclosure and the threshold for making a protected disclosure is pretty low, but those disclosures will have protection, or are likely to have protection, if they relate to an actual or likely breach of a legal obligation. So that could easily be a health and safety obligation, or where there is a danger or likely to be a danger to health and safety. So that's a sort of a category on its own, if you like. And then if the complaint is about the covering up either of that health and safety danger or the breach of a legal obligation. And again, these are day one rights. Again, they apply to both detriment and to dismissal. But it's worth noting that if an employee raises a complaint of this nature, is then dismissed, that there's no cap on the compensation that they would be entitled to receive. And equally, they can make a claim for what's called interim relief, which if successful, allows them to either be reinstated, and if an employer doesn't want to reinstate them, then to have their full pay and benefit paid up until the time of the tribunal hearing, regardless of whether or not they're successful. So I think these kind of complaints come with a big health warning, no pun intended, that they will need to be dealt with very, very carefully. And that the kind of complaint that we're talking about could be just simply a refusal to come back to work with a bit more information. So as innocuous it may seem, I think that you need to keep your eyes open and be aware of the potential risks that those kind of claims can present or complaints present. So, I mean, that's what I see as the sort of main sort of legal claims that arise from this context. As I mentioned in the beginning, I thought it'd be worth just mentioning testing, because again, that's something that our clients are exploring in terms of providing testing to their employees as part of this whole these measures of employees feeling comfortable that they're returning to a workplace where there is a reduced risk of, by virtue of being there, they're likely to get COVID. And clearly that's a good thing, but in order to be able to deal with it effectively, it's likely that an employer will want to understand whether an employee tests positive so it can then take measures to protect its other employees. And that throws up quite challenging data protection issues, which have been recognised by the Information Commissioner's Office, and there is guidance on the Information Commissioner's Office website, which addresses that. But I think that's worth something. It's worth you recognising that there are those legal obligations that extend beyond just the simple testing itself. I think it's also worth noting that it's not going to be possible to have required testing. So you can't force your employees to do that. And if you do, then that's likely to be unlawful. How you deal with those situations, well, again, that goes back to the policies and procedures that you put in place, so that if an employee thinks that they may suffer symptoms or have symptoms whilst at work, then there are a whole range of measures and steps that are adopted in order to then deal with that situation. And as I said, that then falls within the whole range of policies and procedures, which will need to be supported by management, training in relation to them, and then for them to be enforced or policed and enforced and monitored. So again, yeah, that's that constant engagement with employees and those procedures that you're proposing to put in place with them, just to make sure that they work and they maintain that safety in the workplace. That's it from me for the legal issues. I'll now hand over to Sasha.
Justin, thank you very much indeed. That was utterly fascinating, and it's a delight to be part of this webinar. So I'm going to talk about the things that I think employers and organizations should be thinking about with this transition back into a physical workplace. And I'm coming at it from a psychological perspective and very much from an inclusivity perspective. It's not lost on me that over the last 7 or 8 weeks, maybe, well, obviously longer actually from a UK-centric perspective, that organizations have responded in the most incredible way to their populations working predominantly from lockdown from home. What we've witnessed is the biggest unplanned experiment of working from home ever. And I think that generally speaking, where that's been possible, the experience has been maybe more successful than many employers would have guessed. As we now are on the cusp in the UK of businesses reopening, and obviously, as Darryl said, we've seen the high street partially reopen this morning, and it seems that certainly from the retail sector, there are a lot of people out there looking to buy clothes again, which absolutely staggers me, but hey ho. What we're seeing is actually, I think, a real need to recognise how working from home has affected your employee base. And it is absolutely not a one size fits all. There will be the social animals that are desperate to get back into a physical workplace. And then you're going to have people on the other end of the spectrum that have utterly thrived and it really embraced working, from their home, from their studio or from their house or whatever. And so one of the things we've recognized as an inclusion consultancy is really trying to think about, as Darryl said, the employee experience of what this new normal will look like. For some people, they're going to be excited, and some people are going to be extremely hesitant about having to go back into a physical workplace. And I think if we cut this and look at it strategically and then operationally, the lived experience of COVID has meant that organizations have had to recognize that inclusion and an inclusivity strategy is an absolute must in terms of boardroom conversations. And it would be remiss of me to have this conversation and not acknowledge the enormous impact that we are seeing day to day of the race situation and Black Lives Matters, because when people go back into a workplace, there are elements of your employee base that are going to be much more fragile over and above the COVID experience because of that. So from a strategic perspective, we would like people to be thinking at a very senior level about reduction of bias and inclusivity strategy. And it's not lost on me that hate speech on social media in the last 10, 11 weeks is up 900%. That is in relation to the Chinese community. But inclusion matters because we're more polarized now than when we went down. And that's got to be part of an overall, how do we introduce people into a physical workplace if that's what's happening to us. So I just wanted to really get you thinking about that. And in that inclusion strategy becomes wellness and well-being. So obviously Justin's talked very eloquently about health and safety. The psychological health and safety elements of your employee base are very, very significant. If we look at resilience and the appetite that we have from our corporate and cross-sector client base in this period, the appetite for increasing resilience has gone through the roof, and that is going to increase. So I think you need to be thinking, how can we continue to help our people deal with the situations that they're dealing with? It doesn't stop because there may be some migration back to a physical workplace. So what are you doing about wellness and resilience? And therefore, we need to think about this operationally, and we need to think from a leadership perspective. Number one, how good are your leaders at listening? Listening is so underrated. How good are we at listening? Because it is not a one size fits all. And if people are very nervous about, quite frankly, the commute, and then what's my employee experience when I'm back there, I can see environments where clearly we can't have hot desking, where you get more siloed communities just because of the infrastructure when certain people are back in an office. So listening and understanding, and that's about empathy, and that's about a cognizance of bias, unconscious bias. And because people are in a panic situation, or have been or are in a panic situation, that heightens the biases that we have, and it makes it much more easier for an operational perspective for a manager just to reach to the familiar few. And that again creates more isolation at a time where we should be thinking about community, and we should be thinking more about how do we connect everybody? How do we drive the innovation we need to pivot as an organization to survive in the next 5 years? And that's about a culture. Do you have a culture where there is high psychological safety? And just briefly, what that means is an environment that if I feel unsafe, I can turn around to Justin or Darryl and say, I'm actually really feeling unsafe. I need to talk to you about what that looks like, and see if we can work out how you can make me feel safer, and what I can do myself to make Sasha feel safer. So psychological safety is absolutely integral to inclusion and to innovation, and to, again, creating this new normal that allows people to do their best work, to be really productive. And I think what people are looking for is reassurance and support. So a regular drumbeat of comms, good comms coming from your managers, coming from senior management. Consistency is everything because of trust. And now is the time to reinforce your organizational values, to also combat misconduct at a time of negative psychological safety. Please do not think that digital discrimination doesn't happen. It absolutely does. And so again, I think it's important to intermesh this in terms of things like managing performance. I've had a lot of conversations with clients over the last few weeks about how do we manage performance? Because from a line management perspective, that might seem like just a headache too far. And again, as we know from an employment law perspective, we're just creating problems in the future if we're not managing performance. So I think everybody needs extra care and extra help. One of the things that's worked really well in lockdown, in driving culture, has been the humanization of the workplace. And I think we need to continue to do this. And what does that actually mean? That means when senior leaders have sat on Zoom calls and told it how it is for them, when they have revealed their vulnerability, their fragility. And the fact is, this is incredibly we're opening ourselves out by sitting here on Zoom calls where you can see our backdrop. And what we've seen has been this invasion of our personal space into the workplace, pets, children, plants, chaos, and it's humanized things. And actually, I think it'd be a real shame to go back. There's so much to be gained, I think, the lessons we're learning. We don't want to go back. And what this has done is it's made people very human. When I've talked to my team, I can tell them quite honestly and authentically, these have been some really bad moments. where I was going to be sucked into the carpet and scream my head off at my adolescent children who seem to do nothing but watch television. And then, just these small things. And I think the humanization should continue, and that's again from a leadership perspective, how we can again drive the engagement and drive the wellness, because people sharing their stories, which again last week and increasingly around Black Lives Matters and various other iterations of diversity we're seeing more of, and it drives empathy and it makes people more human. And I'd also recommend a continuation of pulse checks, checking in with how people are following trends, using data analytics, because chances are for many organizations, your new normal will be blended. It will be people working from anywhere, people in an office. So actually, line managers have to work harder to bind the team, to keep the comms going, to keep the purpose going. And I hope that in this relatively short period of time, I've sort of wrapped a few things up that I think it's helpful to think about going forward. As we said at the front end, frankly, we're all pedaling like mad under the water, and we're all not quite sure what's going to happen. And as long as we can learn in this together. But I really think an awareness of unconscious bias and an awareness how the COVID experience has disproportionately affected different parts of the employee base is a very good start point. Ultimately, inclusion strategy, it's no good just paying some sort of lip service and virtue signaling. Now is the time that the employee base is going to look for really authentically that you can do more in this space. Over to you, Darryl.
Right, thank you. Thanks. That's fantastic, and some really, really important communication messages and things to consider there. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what all this means for communication. So what do we do with that as communicators in a business? I think one of the things that I've noticed is that most companies have really stepped up their communications in the last 3 or 4 months, both in terms of frequency. I saw some survey information from HR Data Hub yesterday that showed I think most companies are doing either daily or weekly or even twice daily communications, and leaders have really stepped into this space as well. So once was the domains of maybe internal comms or different, potentially sometimes even faceless communications from an organization. It's now, to your point, Sasha, has become really informal. It's become human, authentic, and really leader-led, which is brilliant to see. And I think that will continue. But I thought we'd just think about, what are the things before you start thinking about developing a comms plan to engage and inspire and kind of motivate people, what do you need to do? Well, I think the first thing is to really get senior buy-in. Make sure that your leaders right at the top of the business understand their role, understand the opportunity, and understand what needs to happen in the next few weeks. And I'd suggest really don't underestimate this time at all. How you support your people through this period, well, previously in the last few weeks, but ongoing, is going to shape your culture. It's going to shape your reputation. It's how people will talk about you. It's how employees will talk. Internal and external is just one thing now. So employees talk on Twitter and externally, and how you treat them will be how it defines your business and actually your employer brand to an extent, and even your EVP. And to pick up on Justin's point, I think we shouldn't underestimate this time, because it's actually about managing business risk. While that might sound quite serious as a topic for communicating to employees, it is about managing risk and making sure that you keep your people safe, keep yourself safe as a business. But the most important thing is to really have a strong comms plan. So whoever leads that, and what I'm seeing in organizations is, there's a combination of corporate comms, internal comms, brand, marketing, HR, IT, all coming together to really shape this communications, because it touches on channels and messaging and employment law and all sorts of things there. So, get the right team together of people that can really shape a great comms plan, and then think about who it's going to. And at the moment, there's a whole lot of different stakeholders that we need to think about. Certainly leadership, facilities management are involved. They play a big role in the safety and health and logistics of making a safe workplace. Health and safety teams, operations, crisis comms, corporate comms. So there's a whole lot of different people that you need to engage in order to make sure they're on board and joined up. before you even start thinking about communicating to employees. I thought I'd just talk about one of our clients, Reckitt Benckiser, at the moment. They've done a superb, very quick work actually out of the gate to develop a really comprehensive guide called Navigating Our New Normal, which is published on their website, rb.com, if you want to go and have a look at it. And they've really taken an approach of making sure that it's a brilliant playbook or a guide that's actually aimed at employees, but also people that have to deliver the experience and deliver the regulations and the guidelines actually on the ground. They've called it Navigating Our New Normal because it kind of ties in with very much with their purpose, their fight, and their compass, which is all about their new values and the direction of their business. And they've approached it with 5 principles, which I think are really, really strong and worth highlighting. Firstly, people first. So health, safety, and well-being is the first consideration. Make it locally led. So have some global guidelines that are applicable to everybody, but actually locally implemented. So make sure people are able to implement things on the ground, following guidelines. Make it structured and phased, because clearly there's going to be a very phased approach to how businesses open up. You know, obviously retail's back today, but you know, other businesses are going to take weeks or several months to come back to work. They talk about mutual accountability, which is important. I think that means we will all take ownership together. So it's not just being told, it's about actually taking ownership and accountability for delivering the right things in the right location for people. And the final one is about protecting the front line. So clearly, much like keeping the business running, keeping it safe, making sure that we're protecting the business and the front line. So, you know, I'd welcome you to go and have a look at that on their website. It's really a really great comprehensive document that we've helped them support with some video, some presentations for leaders, some resources to really help them roll this out throughout the business. So I just wanted to wrap up with just a few kind of pointers or principles that we recommend in this period just to think about. Firstly, as Sasha and Justin mentioned about listen to your people. I think this is a really important thing. Survey them, ask them, have focus groups, have conversations, just find out what they want in terms of working preference, how they want to come back to work, what are their concerns, is it travel, is it safety, is it health? And clearly that blend is going to be the way forward, but what does that look like and how can you understand what that means in practice? Second one is about setting the tone. It's a time when it's a mix of information and instructional information, but also messages and communications that you want to kind of motivate and not so much inspire, but support people. So think about what's the balance between getting the balance of instruction versus support language, and what does that look like? And also be clear on what are rules versus what are guidelines. So what are the rules that people must do versus the guidelines where there's some kind of wiggle room and things people may, you know, use their judgment. That's quite important in a time when people are looking for direction and looking for support. That's really important to get right. So there's no ambiguity in the areas that you don't need it in. Set expectations as well. You know, things will change. It's an evolving situation. The guidelines, the UK government's going to release some new guidelines in early July. And after that, it'll probably change again. So I think set the expectation that, you know, we're in this together, we're going to work it out, it's going to change, just go with us and build trust that people can be supported. Be true to your brand promise and your values. And you mentioned that, both of you have mentioned that as well. The brand promise is what you stand for your customers. So think about what are messages that you're putting out there to externally to customers and in the market, and think about, you know, is that reflected internally? Are we supporting it? We're helping people tell the right story and be consistent with your values. You know, are they supporting other behaviours of your values? Are they helping you through this situation? And I know some companies are even looking at the values and think, we've done some things differently in the last 12 weeks or so that aren't quite reflected in the values. So maybe it's time to step back and have a look and say, are they right? Do we need to evolve them? What might need to change? And just on the last point about consistency, I think this is really important. Be consistent with your messages, but also consistent with the timing. One thing that we found in our business particularly is that having some certainty about when the communications are coming is really important, and it's really reassuring for people because they know that, oh, on Thursday afternoon I'm going to hear from the CEO, whether there's anything new to say or not, and there will be plenty to say. That certainty of knowing when I can expect some new information every week even, I think is really reassuring and really helpful for businesses. So yeah, lots to think about. It's a bit of a tsunami of things to consider and manage in the business, but really exciting times at the same time. There's the opportunity to really shape how we work, I think, which was quite fun. So thank you both. I think we've had some questions through. I've got one for Justin here. With working from home possible to continue for a significant period, is there an obligation to undertake workspace assessments for the employees' workstations at home? And is there a period of time that could constitute a change in contract terms in place of work?
I think definitely in terms of health and safety assessments, then yes, strictly speaking, that's something that employers should be doing with their employees who are working from home. Clearly, it's very difficult to do that and impossible to do that, or it certainly has been so far, to do that in person. So it would have to be conducted by some sort of, Skype or sort of Teams type communication. So that, I mean, particularly in terms of those people that are sitting there working with computers and desks set up, etc., then I think, yes, that probably is something that employers should be dealing with, or at least have alerted people that if they felt as if they needed help with it, then that was something that they could reach out and ask for. And I think that it's likely that employers will have to, we talked a lot about policies and procedures, but I think it's a time that, and how they'll enable us to come back to the workplace. The flip side equally applies in how those policies and procedures which enhance employees working from home, given that that's something that we're likely to see, as the person who raised the question points out, certainly extending into the future for some time. And indeed, as the speakers have already identified, the fact that this has spelled out a new approach to working, and for some people that working from home is a positive experience and one that they would ideally like to persist with. So I think it's important that certainly those health and safety assessments are addressed as part of that whole package of addressing the working from home experience. Is there a period of time that would constitute a change? Well, I think that at the moment, and my expectation would be that things have probably been couched in quite temporary terms, that none of this was nobody knew at the beginning of lockdown how long it would last, how long we would be enduring these working arrangements. And I think just that for the most part, employers would have been informing employees that these things are under review. And I think in that context, it would be difficult to regard them as permanent, or having, or there have been a sort of a permanent change to terms and conditions. I think that could change with the messaging, and to the extent that there are then a change in the perspective that actually these are going to be longer term measures, that this is going to be something that employers will expect their employees to be doing for a much longer period, then I think in the context of that discussion, then yes, potentially that would involve a change in the normal place of work.
Thank you. And I've got a question for Sasha. What's the one thing do you think leaders should be focusing on right now?
Well, that's a really difficult question. I think leadership should be focusing on behaviours that drive an inclusive culture. So I think it's the time for leadership to step up. And yeah, as we all know, lots of people get promoted into management roles, not because they're necessarily any good at managing people, but they're intrinsically good at their underlying job. So I think at a senior leadership level, we should be looking at how do we develop people quite quickly to basically drive inclusion and therefore productivity and innovation. And I think that given the success of raising awareness and of communicating through things like Teams and Zoom, using sort of quick interventions that are really relatable virtually is a very smart way to start. And all of that is infinitely possible. But people have to be motivated. They have to go, what's the why? And the why is, sorry, there's a fly in here. The why is, how do we optimize? How do we move forward as a business? How do we make sure that the people are valued and appreciated and enjoy their experience of being in the workplace? Because as Darryl's quite rightly pointed out, this stuff is all an extension of your brand. And when people leave or are not happy, it's appearing instantaneously on social media and therefore affects the whole part of this. So I would say just really work on helping your people who lead people do the very best job they can and give them the tools and skills and support to do that, to optimize people.
Thank you. Thanks. That's all the questions we have, unless anybody has anything else they wanted to pop through. But so otherwise, thank you very much for your time. It's been great. Appreciate you taking the time, and all the best. If you have any other questions, we're happy to help. Please get in touch.